All right, so I'd like all of you to do this with me. All right, so I want everyone to draw a set of stars. Actually, I want the stars to be identical. So we'll just copy and paste it. So I'm going to make a star, and this one has a 10-point stroke. And then I'm going to Command-C, Command-V it. So I have two stars. Two stars. They kind of look like luchador eyes. Does it look kind of like luchador eyes? Like on the mask, like eyes? No? Okay, Diego. They look like luchador eyes to me. All right, so I have a question for you. The stroke on this star is set to 10. Now, when I scale this object, is the stroke going to scale with the object, or is it going to stay at 10? What's going to happen? What do you think? Is it going to stay at 10? Or if I scale it by 200%, is it going to go up to 20? Why don't you guys try it? Scale it up using the bounding box. So grab the bounding box and scale it, and then I want you to tell me what happened. Can anybody give me an answer? What happened? Oh, come! You guys are like the quietest class I've ever had. It stayed the same for you? Everybody got the same answer? What did you get? The stroke got bigger on yours. So yours stayed the same and hers got bigger. Huh. Well, what's going on? That's why I asked this question. Because it's not uniform. And the feature is controlled in the modification tools. So at this point, we've discussed some of the selection tools. We've discussed the black arrow, select, the white arrow, direct select, and we've reviewed a number of the creation tools. Well, now we're in this space. This is called the modification tools. And you'll notice that this tool right here, what is this tool called? Scale tool. So the scale tool is the same thing as if we were engaging with the bounding box. So I can scale an object by manipulating the bounding box, or I can double click on the scale tool, and this will create the scale tool panel. So I can scale an object here and type in a percentage. So I'm going to scale this up by 200%. And you'll notice that there's a preview button. So when I hit preview, you'll notice that it scales the object. Now, some of you experienced that the strokes stayed the same. Some of you experienced that it changed. That's because the bounding box is looking at this panel, and it's referencing the options that you've selected in this space. You'll notice that under options, you have the ability to scale corners, and you have the ability to scale strokes and effects. So the decision is made here. So do I want the strokes and effects to scale up with it, or do I not? So which one do I select? Which one do I select? Which one should I use? Which one should I use? What do you think? It's kind of a trick question, actually. It depends on the outcome. So there isn't a right or wrong. Sometimes you want the strokes to be the same. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you want to scale it up. So it depends on what you're trying to do. So I'm going to leave mine on. I'm going to scale the strokes and effects. And you'll notice that in this case, when I scale the object up, the stroke went up to 20. The original was set to 10. Right? Let's paste again. So here's another copy of the star. And I'm going to scale it down. And the star has a stroke of 1.731. So when you scale the strokes and effects, the stroke is now proportionately correct to the object size. It's relative to the object size. So meaning if this object gets bigger, then the stroke would get bigger. This object gets smaller, the stroke gets smaller. So in this case, the strokes are relatively correct in terms of size and scale, relative to one another. But you may not always want that. And that's when you would shut off that feature. So where do I turn off and on the scaling of the stroke? What panel was that? What panel was it? Scale. So the scale tool allows me to do that. Right, so that's where that's good. And in this space, we can also control a scale by a specific percentage, or you could also do a non-proportional scale at a specific percentage, right? I could do horizontal 100, vertical 200, and I'm going to get a very, very specific outcome. Okay, so that's scale, strokes, and effects. I'm going to select all of this and hit delete. Underneath the scale tool, I have two other modification tools. We are going to go over one of them right now. We'll skip the other one. So this one right here is called the Shear tool. The Shear tool. You'll notice the icon looks like a rectangle that's being sort of blown by the wind. That's sort of how I describe it. So there's like a little arrow there, and it looks like it's blowing it on the wind, sort of like a flag or something like that. So I'm going to draw a star again. I'm going to make a more simplistic star. I don't like my 8-sided star. I'll go with a 5-sided star. Okay, so this is how the Shear tool works. You can engage with it in one of two ways. You can double click on it, and that brings up the Shear panel. And you have something called the shear angle. Now you'll notice that the field is highlighted in blue. If I hit my up arrow or down arrow, you'll notice that it changes the number, and it has that blown in the wind like quality, or italic like quality. And if you hold shift when you hold your arrow keys, you'll notice that it jumps in 10% increments. 10% increments. Okay, so that's basically what the Shear tool does. It sort of makes things look like it's moving or being blown by the wind, or it looks italic. There's probably a lot of different ways you can describe that. You can also manually set shear angle. So I'm not using the settings, I'm just sort of manipulating the star to create a specific look. Okay, super easy tool, not really that complicated. How often do I use this tool? I think I've probably used it a couple dozen times in my career. In what context? Italicizing text. Or if I'm drawing a logo and I want it to look like it's a little bit faster, I'll take the logo and slightly shear it, and all of a sudden it looks like it has some slight movement. Like a lightning bolt as well, yep. Something like that, where it has some movement, a little bit more character. That's it. I don't really use it to illustrate a lot, okay? But, you know, I think it has a nice purpose. So it has some possibilities to it. All right, so we've discussed in terms of modification scale. We've talked about shear, and there's two more that I want to wrap up for our class, and then we're going to take a break and we're going to change gears a little bit. So there are two tools to the right of the scale tool. There's one called rotate and one called reflect. Rotate and reflect. So I'm going to tear this set away, place it over here. I'm back on my star. Okay, so, all right, so when I go to the bounding box and I hover over the corner, you'll notice that I can manually rotate my object, right? We know that. So I can scale my object through the bounding box. I can change the position of the object through the bounding box, and I can rotate through the bounding box. So I know I can do all three of those things through the bounding box. I just learned that I can set a specific scale through the scale tool. Let's see what rotate gives me. So when I click on rotate, the rotation actually changes a little bit. When you activate rotate, you also activate this little point in the middle of the object. Let me do that again. So look, this is what it looks like without the rotate tool. this is what it looks like with the rotate tool. You'll notice that I get this little point right here. This point is referred to as a pivot point, a pivot point. That means that I can rotate the object along the pivot. The pivot is usually at the center. But now that I'm in the rotate tool, I can change the pivot point to a new location. I can put the pivot point at the top of the star. And you can change the pivot point location by clicking directly on it. So I'm going to click right on it, and I'm going to move it to the point of the star. And now I can rotate the star along that point instead. Okay, so it's a relatively important tool. It may not be that important in Illustrator, but if you ever work in animation like After Effects or anything else that has motion, changing pivot points and rotation along a non-centered pivot point will play a really big role in some of the things that you do. So look, I just moved the pivot point to the bottom, right? Or I can move the pivot point out here, right? So I can change the pivot point. If I double click on rotation, it also allows me to rotate along a specific degree. So if I have a client and says, oh, you need to move that by 10 degrees, well, you know, I can be that accurate with it. So it's a tool with great accuracy in terms of rotation. All right, so that's our rotate tool. Pretty easy as well. The special thing is the pivot point. Any questions or concerns about that? All right, one more, and then we'll take our last break, and then we're gonna start talking about some homework assignments. Okay, so last one is this one. This is called the reflect tool. The reflect tool. And if you zoom into the icon, you'll notice that it looks like a triangle along an axis that's been reflected like a mirror on the opposite side. Right? So I took a triangle and I mirrored it. Right, so I'm going to draw an object that has what's called biradial symmetry. Biradial symmetry. And so that's an object that if you took one half of it and illustrated that and then made a copy and made a mirror, it would complete the object. So we exhibit that if you think about it, okay? But I'm going to draw, I'm going to go to my, I'm going to go to this brush tool out here, and I'm going to brush out a butterfly, or half of a butterfly. So here's my lovely butterfly, and I'm going to select all of this, and I'm going to double click on reflect. Let me do that again. I selected everything, and I'm going to double click on reflect. Now I can reflect the object horizontally, or I can reflect the object vertically, or I can set my own angle. Normally I use vertical. Usually I seem to illustrate that way. Okay, so when we work with these modification tools, you'll notice that we have 3 options at the bottom of this panel. Now, if I cancel out, that means, hey, I didn't like what was happening, I want to start all over again, or I don't want to use that tool after all. So that's what canceling out does, right? So if I cancel out, it just says, hey, take me back to where I was. Pretty straightforward. All right, so another option that I have is OK. OK. So let me hit OK. Now, it flipped the butterfly, but is it complete? No. Okay, so let's see what else I have. If I double click on reflect and I hit copy, you'll notice that it leaves the original behind and it places a new one on top. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't place it exactly where I want it, so I do have to slide it over. And I'm using the arrow keys, but you'll notice that all I have to do is slide it over and I have my complete butterfly. I drew half of it and I had the software draw the other half for me. Okay, so this is a very common illustration strategy, and this is the tool that would help us accomplish that. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, let me do that one more time. All right, so I'm going to draw a butterfly. Is there anything else that would be bisymmetrical? I can't think of anything. I'm afraid of drawing a person because they usually look really weird. So I'll select all of this, go to reflect, hit copy, slide it over. All right, I have a butterfly. Okay, pretty straightforward. Really nice tool. Okay, so let's review our agendas. Here's our agenda 7. So we talked about strokes and profiles. We went over that. It was a little bit of review. We went over the pen tool, and we discussed open paths versus closed paths. We continued to discuss creation tools. We've wrapped up most of them. And we started to talk about modification tools. We went over rotate and scale. And we actually are now partially in our agenda number 8. So let me open that up so we can take a look at that. So we looked at some more modification tools. I want to take a break. When we come back, we're going to look at 2 tools, one called the blend tool and one called live paint. So from my point of view, we have officially completed sort of the intro, the introduction to Illustrator. And from this point forward, we're going to start looking at more complex tools and features. These are tools that require some comfort level and know-how within the software. So we need to know how to draw shapes, we need to know how to group things, we need to know how to manage our layers. So I feel that we've covered most of the things that we need to know to get us to this point. So when we come back, there are 2 color tools that we're going to talk about, one called Blend and the other one called Live Paint. And then at probably 5:50, we'll take another break, and the last half hour that we have together, we will discuss our homework assignments. Okay? Thank you. 5 minutes.